London burned quietly at first. A warehouse near the docks erupted into gunfire and screaming as ghouls poured out into the streets, tearing through civilians before anyone understood what was happening. By the time black vans skidded into position and heavy weapons answered back, the damage was already done. That was when a second hunter entered the chaos, moving through smoke and blood with practiced efficiency. Blade didn't announce himself. He carved a path through ghouls with silver and steel, fast, precise, already bleeding from a wound he hadn't had time to close. These weren't the vampires he knew. They didn't hesitate. They didn't retreat. And when the last one fell, something worse stepped into the open, smiling as if the fight had just started. Red eyes, a grin too wide, guns raised in lazy confidence. Alucard watched Blade the way a lion watches a knife, amused, curious, untouched by the carnage around him. Blade realized it instantly. This wasn't another monster to kill. This was the ceiling of the world pressing down. So the question wasn't whether Blade could win. It was whether he could survive long enough to matter. If you were dropped into a world where immortality laughs at skill, would you adapt, retreat, or die standing your ground? Stay with this story, choose carefully, and consider subscribing to see how survival changes when power has a face and it's smiling at you. The warehouse had already gone quiet by the time Blade realized London hunted differently than anywhere he'd been before. Bodies lay scattered across the concrete floor, ghouls shredded by silver-edged blades and ultraviolet bursts that still hummed faintly in the air. Blade stood among them, chest rising and falling steadily, coat torn at the shoulder where something with too many teeth had managed to get close. He pressed 2 fingers briefly against the wound, assessing. Not fatal, slower healing than he liked. Whatever strain infected these creatures burned hotter than the vampires he knew. Outside, sirens wailed in tight, controlled patterns. Not police, not military, something cleaner. Blade moved toward the exit just as heavy gunfire tore through the night. The doors blew inward, shredded by armor-piercing rounds that chewed through remaining ghouls with ruthless efficiency. Men in black uniforms advanced in perfect formation, weapons barking in short, disciplined bursts. Their movements were precise, rehearsed, and completely unafraid of what they were killing. Blade stepped back into shadow and watched. This wasn't chaos response, this was extermination. The ghouls didn't stand a chance. They rushed and died in seconds, bodies collapsing into ash under sustained fire that burned with strange runes etched into the casings. Blade recognized alchemical signatures in the flashes. Someone here had figured out how to industrialize vampire killing. Then the guns stopped. A tall woman stepped forward, posture rigid, presence absolute. Her blonde hair was pulled back tight, eyes cold as she surveyed the carnage. Integra Hellsing didn't ask questions yet. She took inventory. Blade could feel it from where he stood. This was someone who expected control and rarely tolerated deviation from it. "Secure the perimeter," she ordered calmly. "No survivors." Blade turned to leave. The air shifted. A ripple of pressure rolled through the warehouse like something exhaling. Shadows bent inward, drawn toward a single point behind Integra's position. Blade felt it instantly, instinct screaming louder than any alarm he'd ever heard. This wasn't power flaring. This was power waking up. A man stepped out of the darkness behind the soldiers. Red coat, wide grin, eyes like open wounds in the dark. Alucard. The soldiers didn't react. They didn't need to. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't their concern. Blade, however, couldn't look away. He'd faced elder vampires before. He fought creatures older than nations. None of them felt like this. Alucard looked at the bodies, then at Integra, unimpressed. His gaze drifted lazily across the warehouse until it settled on Blade's hiding place. The smile sharpened. "Well now," Alucard said conversationally, "that's not one of ours." Blade moved before thought caught up. A flashbang detonated near the exit, ultraviolet light flooding the space as Blade burst through smoke and debris, firing silver rounds to clear a path. He didn't aim for Alucard. That would have been stupid. He aimed for escape. He didn't make it 5 steps. Alucard was suddenly there, blocking the exit without having crossed the space between. Blade skidded to a halt, already pivoting, blade in hand. Alucard looked down at the weapon with interest, then back at Blade's face. "Oh," he said pleasantly, "you're trying." Blade slashed. The blade cut cleanly through Alucard's torso, severing spine and organs in a strike that would have ended anything else. Alucard fell apart in 2 neat pieces. Blade didn't celebrate. He kept moving. Alucard reassembled behind him with a wet, amused sound, body knitting itself together without urgency. Blade felt the pressure at his back and dove as a massive hand crashed through the space where his head had been. Concrete exploded. The building shuddered. Integra raised an eyebrow. Blade rolled, came up firing silver rounds punching through Alucard's skull, chest, limbs. Each hit staggered him just enough to buy space. Not victory, space. Blade used it, retreating toward an open wall blown apart by earlier fighting. Alucard laughed, genuinely entertained now. Bullets tore through him, and he let them, watching Blade with growing fascination as flesh reformed faster than Blade could reload. Not human, Alucard noted. Not quite vampire, how quaint. Blade hit the open air, leaping from the warehouse into the dockyard below, landing hard and sprinting without looking back. He could hear Alucard's footsteps behind him, unhurried, unthreatened. Then the gunfire resumed. Heavy-caliber rounds hammered into Alucard from multiple angles, pinning him mid-step. Hellsing soldiers repositioned with brutal efficiency, containment lines snapping into place. Sierra's Victoria stood among them, eyes wide, finger tight on the trigger as she watched Alucard get torn apart and laughed through it. "Sir Integra?" she asked uncertainly. Integra didn't look away from Blade's retreating figure disappearing into the maze of shipping containers. "Let him go," she said calmly. Alucard's head snapped back into place as bullets fell uselessly to the ground. He looked disappointed but obeyed, straightening his coat as if he hadn't just been shredded. "A shame," he said. "He runs." "He survives," Integra corrected, "which makes him a problem." Blade vanished into the city, wounded, low on ammunition, mind racing. This world had rules he didn't understand yet, power structures he hadn't mapped, monsters he couldn't kill the way he was used to. Behind him, alarms echoed as Hellsing secured the site. Above it all, Alucard's laughter followed him into the dark, not predatory, not angry. "Interested?" Blade slowed only once, pressing his back against a brick wall, forcing his breathing steady as his wound burned. He checked his weapons, counted what he had left, and made a decision he hated. He wouldn't hunt tonight. He would learn. Because whatever he just crossed into wasn't a battlefield he could dominate. It was a food chain. And something at the top had just noticed him. Blade spent the next 48 hours doing what he did best when the ground shifted under his feet. He disappeared. London was loud, crowded, and layered with surveillance, but Blade had lived off-grid in cities that actively wanted him dead. He moved through back alleys, abandoned rail lines and forgotten basements, stitching himself up with practiced efficiency while replaying the warehouse encounter over and over. Alucard hadn't fought seriously. That much was obvious. The speed, the regeneration, the casual way he'd let himself be cut apart all pointed to something operating under entirely different rules. Blade didn't like rules he couldn't break. The wound in his shoulder closed slower than normal, burning with a chemical irritation he hadn't felt before. Whatever strain animated the ghouls had teeth, and London's vampires weren't content with hiding in the margins. They moved in packs, bold and sloppy, as if daring someone to stop them. Blade picked off a pair in White-Capelle that first night, learning quickly that they didn't fear silver the way they should. They died, but not cleanly, thrashing and screaming until he put them down with excessive force. Someone was pushing them. He felt it the third night, the moment he realized he was being herded. The ambush came in Camden, narrow streets funneling him into a kill zone packed with armed vampires wearing outdated uniforms and grinning like they'd been promised something glorious. Blade took 3 down before the rest opened fire, forcing him into cover as tracer rounds chewed through brick and steel. This wasn't feral behavior. This was organized, ideological. Millennium. Blade didn't know the name yet, but he recognized the intent. These weren't predators hunting food. They were soldiers trying to make a point. He retreated by design, drawing them deeper into the maze, planting UV charges and silver traps that shredded the first wave and slowed the second. It bought him minutes, not safety. The numbers kept coming, and for the first time since arriving, Blade considered that staying mobile might not be enough. That was when the helicopters arrived. Searchlights snapped on overhead, pinning the street in harsh white beams. Heavy weapons fire erupted from above, cutting through Millennium vampires with brutal efficiency. Blade looked up just in time to see black silhouettes rappel down ropes, landing between him and the remaining attackers. Hellsing. The firefight ended fast. Blade watched from cover as Sierra's Victoria tore through the last of them with raw, unrefined power, her expression torn between fear and exhilaration. She was strong, but undisciplined, reacting instead of controlling the field. Blade noted it automatically. When the smoke cleared, rifles swung toward him. "Don't," Sierra said quickly, stepping forward before the others could fire. "He's not with them." Integra emerged from the helicopter moments later, coat immaculate despite the chaos. Her gaze locked onto Blade immediately, sharp and assessing, as if she'd been expecting this moment. "You've been busy," she said calmly, eyes flicking to the ash-stained ground, "and remarkably difficult to track." Blade didn't lower his weapons. He didn't raise them either. He held still, letting the standoff breathe. "Your city's got a vampire infestation problem," he replied flatly, "and a bigger one wearing a red coat." Alucard appeared behind Integra without announcement, hands in his pockets, eyes gleaming with delight. "Oh good," he said, "you stayed." Blade shifted his stance subtly, weight centered, ready to move if this turned ugly. Alucard noticed. Of course he did. Integra raised a hand and the soldiers held position. "You are not our enemy," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But you are not our ally either, at least not yet." Blade exhaled slowly. He'd expected bullets. This was worse. Control. They brought him in under armed escort, not restrained, but never unguarded. Blade cataloged the route, the layers of security, the way every door required multiple confirmations. Hellsing didn't trust anything it couldn't lock down, and Blade respected that instinct even as he resented it. The briefing room was stark and efficient. Screens lit up with footage of Blade's earlier fights, slowed down, analyzed frame by frame. Integra didn't bother pretending this was a negotiation. "You are a hybrid," she stated, "not created by our methods, resistant to standard vampire weaknesses, highly trained, and currently being hunted by Millennium forces at an escalating rate." Blade said nothing. "You are also," she continued, "outmatched by my vampire." Alucard grinned. Integra leaned forward. "Which makes you either a liability or a tool? I intend to determine which." Sierra's watched from the side, eyes flicking between Blade and Alucard. There was sympathy there, mixed with unease. She could feel the difference. Blade wasn't like Alucard. He was closer to her, stuck between what he was and what he chose to be. Blade finally spoke. "I don't work for anyone." "No," Integra agreed. "You don't, but you do understand leverage." She tapped the screen, bringing up satellite images of Millennium troop movements converging on London. "They are adjusting their operations based on your presence. They consider you an insult, a corrupted outcome. Blade's jaw tightened. He'd dealt with that before. "Work with us," Integra said. "Under observation, limited operational autonomy. In exchange, we share intelligence, resources, and keep you alive long enough to be useful." "And if I say no?" Blade asked. Alucard's smile widened. Integra met Blade's gaze evenly. "Then you leave London, and Millennium follows you wherever you go, and next time, Alucard won't be curious." That wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. Blade considered his options. Alone, he could survive. Maybe. Against Millennium and Hellsing operating independently, the odds collapsed fast. Cooperation didn't mean obedience, but it did mean compromise. He nodded once. "Temporary," he said. Integra accepted it with a curt nod. "Classified asset," she replied, "until proven otherwise." Alucard laughed softly, clapping his hands once in delight. "Oh, this will be fun." Blade didn't respond. He was already thinking ahead, already adapting. This world had an apex predator he couldn't challenge directly, a war brewing beneath its streets, and enemies who wanted him dead for what he represented. For now, survival meant alignment. Outside, alarms began to sound again, sharper and more urgent than before. A new Millennium strike had just crossed into the city, larger and better armed than anything prior. Integra turned toward the screens, issuing orders without hesitation. Blade reached for his weapons, checking them with practiced calm. This wasn't his war. But it was about to become his problem. Millennium did not respond to resistance with caution. They responded with enthusiasm. The first confirmed strike after Blade's detainment wasn't subtle or surgical. It was loud, public, and deliberately excessive. A coordinated assault tore through a residential block on the outskirts of London just before dawn, ghouls flooding the streets in military formation while heavy weapons flattened anything that slowed them down. This wasn't feeding. This was provocation. Blade watched the footage from a secure Hellsing operations room, arms folded, jaw tight. The vampires moved like soldiers, covering angles, rotating fire, pushing civilians into kill zones to draw Hellsing response times into the open. He recognized the tactic immediately. They wanted data, reaction speed, thresholds. Integra watched beside him, expression unreadable. "They're testing us," Sira said quietly, knuckles white around her rifle. "They've never hit this openly before." "They're not testing you," Blade corrected. "They're testing how fast you bring him." Alucard, lounging against the far wall, chuckled. "Guilty," he said cheerfully. "They always get so excited when I'm nearby." Integra didn't acknowledge him. Her focus remained on Blade. "Your presence accelerated this," she said flatly. "They've altered their operational tempo since you arrived." Blade didn't argue. He'd known that would happen the moment Millennium spotted him. Hybrid, daywalker, proof that vampirism didn't have to end in monstrosity or obedience. To them, he wasn't just a target. He was an ideological failure that needed to be erased. The response team deployed within minutes. Blade was included, but not unrestrained. Hellsing didn't chain him. They didn't need to. Instead, they layered oversight. Sira's assigned as point. Surveillance drones keyed to his biometrics. Kill permissions one level above his authority. If he crossed a line, someone else would pull the trigger. He accepted it without comment. The battlefield was a nightmare of burning vehicles and screaming civilians. Millennium ghouls moved aggressively, backed by armored transports spitting suppressive fire into evacuation routes. Blade hit the ground running, immediately splitting from Sira's direct line to flank the advance. He didn't rush the strongest cluster, he picked edges, command runners, ammunition carriers, anything that slowed coordination. He took hits doing it, rounds punching through his coat, grazing muscle. Pain sharpened his focus. Healing lagged. He adjusted, conserving movement, shifting angles. Sira's noticed. She watched Blade disengage twice instead of pressing, retreating behind cover to reload rather than charging forward. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. She'd never seen that before in herself. "Blade, they're pushing civilians toward the center," she called out. "I know," he replied. "They want you to lose control." She swallowed and held her fire. Alucard arrived late. He always did. The moment he stepped into the open, Millennium forces redirected almost instantly, abandoning positions to swarm him. Heavy weapons roared. Ghouls rushed screaming, eager to die loudly. Alucard let them, guns blazing, body tearing apart and reassembling in grotesque delight. Blade didn't look at him. He used the shift. With Millennium's focus pulled toward their obsession, Blade slipped deeper into the operation, finding something new. A mobile command unit. Officers barking orders in German, adjusting formations in response to Alucard's movements. Blade marked it, relayed coordinates, and moved in alone. The fight inside the transport was brutal and cramped. Blade took a round through the thigh, nearly went down, and finished the last officer with a silver-edged blade driven up under the jaw. He ripped the data core from the console and limped out just as Hellsing fire reduced the vehicle to scrap. The battle ended within minutes after that. Alucard stood amid the wreckage, laughing as smoke curled around him, ghouls reduced to ash at his feet. To him, it had been a warm-up. To Blade, it had been costly. Sirez reached him first, eyes widening at the blood soaking through his leg. "You're hurt." "I'll live," Blade said, forcing weight onto it anyway. Integra reviewed the data an hour later. Millennium command structures, movement predictions, kill priority lists. Blade's name sat at the top. Integra closed the file slowly. "They're committing," she said. "You're no longer collateral." Alucard's grin sharpened. "Oh, how flattering." Blade didn't share the amusement. Millennium wasn't escalating because of Alucard. They'd already accounted for him. This was different. They were adapting around Blade, treating him as a destabilizing factor in a war they thought they understood. Which meant the next move wouldn't be a probe. It would be a hunt. Blade sat alone in the med bay later, stitching his leg with steady hands as alarms echoed faintly through the complex. He didn't like being the reason a city burned faster, but he'd learned long ago that monsters didn't stop hunting just because you felt guilty about it. Outside the room, Integra watched through reinforced glass. Blade wasn't their strongest asset. He wasn't their most dangerous. But Millennium had just proven something critical. They were afraid of what he represented. And fear, Blade knew, always made enemies sloppy. The next strike wouldn't be random. It would be personal. Millennium stopped pretending London was a battlefield. They turned it into a message. The first explosion went off just after sunset, tearing through a crowded underground station before anyone understood what was happening. The second followed 30 seconds later on a major bridge, collapsing traffic into the river below. By the time emergency services reacted, ghouls were already flooding the streets in coordinated waves, herding civilians into open areas and setting up kill corridors designed for maximum visibility. This wasn't escalation by force. It was escalation by terror. Blade watched the feeds in silence as casualty numbers climbed. He recognized the pattern immediately. Millennium wasn't trying to overwhelm Hellsing's defenses outright. They were forcing responses, dragging Alucard into the open repeatedly, turning every engagement into a spectacle. Every time Alucard appeared, more cameras caught him. Every time he laughed through gunfire, Millennium's propaganda machine grew stronger. Integra slammed her fist lightly against the table. "They're baiting him." Alucard, seated comfortably nearby, smiled without offense. "Of course they are. It's charming." Blade turned toward the screens again. "They're not just baiting him. They're burning your city to prove you can't protect it." Sierra swallowed hard, watching footage of civilians being torn apart before Hellsing units could reach them. Her grip tightened around her weapon. She wanted to move, to charge, to end it fast. Blade saw the tension in her shoulders and recognized the danger. "Don't chase them," he said quietly. "That's what they want." Sierra looked at him, conflicted. "Then what do we do?" Blade exhaled slowly. "We break their rhythm." The next deployment wasn't led by Alucard. That alone changed everything. Hellsing units moved into the city in smaller, faster teams, cutting power to select blocks and funneling Millennium forces away from population centers. Blade worked point with Sierra's, not as a commander, but as a guide, identifying choke points and predicting enemy movements based on their need for spectacle. The first clash came near Piccadilly Circus. Millennium forces surged in heavy numbers, confident, expecting Alucard to crash into them like a wrecking ball. Instead, they found Blade and Sierra's moving through cover, striking hard and withdrawing before retaliation could land. Blade took down officers. Sierra's handled crowd control, her raw strength tearing through ghouls when Blade opened lanes. It worked. For 10 minutes. Then Millennium adjusted. Armored units rolled in, backed by air support, forcing Blade and Sierra's into tighter quarters. Blade took a round to the ribs that cracked bone and sent him skidding across pavement. He rolled behind cover, breath hitching, healing struggling under sustained damage. Sierra's almost lost control. She charged, ripping through enemies with brutal force, screams tearing from her throat as blood soaked the street. Blade saw it happen and forced himself up, pain screaming through him as he grabbed her arm and dragged her back behind cover. "Focus," he snapped. "They want you feral." She shook, eyes glowing, jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. "They're killing people." "I know," Blade said evenly. "That's why we stay sharp." The next explosion rocked the district before either of them could move. A hospital went dark 3 blocks away. Millennium wasn't responding anymore. They were dictating. Alucard arrived seconds later, ripping through enemy lines with obscene enthusiasm, but Blade could see it now. Every time Alucard entered the field, Millennium gained something. Morale, footage, martyrs. The city paid the price. Integra saw it too. Back at headquarters, she made a decision she hated. She restricted Alucard's deployment. Not sealed, not bound. Delayed. Alucard's smile thinned when the order came through. "You're grounding me." "I'm repositioning you," Integra replied coldly. "You are no longer the centerpiece of their strategy." For the first time since Blade had arrived, Alucard looked, intrigued. Millennium responded within the hour. They stopped attacking randomly. They attacked Blade. A coordinated strike hit his position mid-evacuation, heavy fire forcing Hellsing units to pull back as armored vampires closed in from all sides. Blade fought through it, wounded, ammo running low, Sierra's covering his retreat with increasingly desperate force. Then the message came through Millennium's open channel. A distorted voice, cheerful and mocking, broadcast across every unsecured frequency. "Daywalker," it said, "we see you." Blade ducked as a rocket tore through the street, heat washing over him as debris collapsed around his position. He came up firing, cutting down attackers as Sierra's dragged a wounded operative to safety. "You're the mistake," the voice continued. "Neither monster nor man, proof that obedience can fail." Blade felt it settle in his gut. This wasn't about killing him fast. They wanted him broken, public, symbolic. A gunship roared overhead, searchlights locking onto Blade's position. Hellsing units tried to reposition, but Millennium had already anticipated the move. Streets closed, exits burned. Sierra's looked at Blade, fear and determination warring on her face. "We're boxed in." Blade scanned the environment, mind racing. He could fight his way out. Maybe. but not without casualties Hellsing couldn't afford. "Fall back," he said. "There's nowhere." Now Blade snapped. They moved just as the street collapsed behind them in a controlled detonation, Millennium forces sealing the kill zone. Blade barely cleared the blast, body slamming into concrete as the world went white. When his vision cleared, he was alone. Sierra's was gone. Hellsing comms were dead. And the voice returned, closer now. "Well done," it said pleasantly. "You chose survival." Blade pushed himself up, blood dripping from his chin as shapes moved in the smoke around him. This wasn't an ambush. It was an invitation. Blade didn't wait for the smoke to clear. He moved. The moment his feet found traction, he rolled behind a burned-out bus as automatic fire shredded the space where he'd been standing. Concrete chips tore into his coat. One round grazed his shoulder, another punched clean through his calf. Pain flared hot and immediate. Healing lagged. Whatever Millennium was using now was calibrated to hurt him. They had learned. Blade gritted his teeth and forced himself upright, using the bus as cover while he took inventory. 2 blades left, 1 UV charge, 3 silver magazines half spent, no comms, no Sierras, no Hellsing support. This was the scenario he hated most. Isolation by design. Figures moved through the smoke deliberately, not rushing, not firing blindly. These weren't ghouls. These were enhanced vampires in tailored combat armor, visors glowing faint red as they advanced in a loose semicircle. They weren't trying to overwhelm him. They were closing a net. A spotlight snapped on above him, bathing the street in harsh white light. A tall man stepped into view, immaculate uniform, round glasses reflecting the firelight. His smile was polite, almost academic. "The Daywalker," Major Schrödinger said cheerfully. "Such a fascinating contradiction." Blade didn't respond. He hurled a UV charge into the center of the formation and surged left as it detonated, lights screaming across the street. 2 vampires went down instantly, bodies convulsing. Blade followed through, blades flashing, severing heads with brutal efficiency. The others adapted immediately. Visors darkened, shields deployed. Suppressive fire forced Blade back into cover as the Major clapped his hands lightly, delighted. "Oh, excellent," he said. "You're even better up close." Blade took another hit, this one tearing into his side hard enough to stagger him. He barely stayed on his feet, vision tunneling as his body struggled to keep up. He couldn't win this head-on, not injured, not outnumbered. So he did what Millennium didn't expect. He ran straight at them. Blade charged through the gap created by the UV blast, sliding under a shield and driving a blade up through the underside of a vampire's jaw. He used the body as cover for half a second, ripped free, and threw himself into a narrow alley just as rockets turned the street behind him into fire. The alley dead-ended. Blade hit the wall hard, breath ripping out of him as something massive crashed down behind him. A vampire twice his size, armored and grinning, blocked the only exit. Blade slashed, but the blade skidded off reinforced plating. The brute laughed and swung. Blade went through the wall instead. He crashed into an abandoned shop, glass and shelving exploding around him. He rolled, came up firing, and finally dropped the brute with a silver round through the visor. He staggered, leaned against the counter and felt the room tilt. He wouldn't make it another minute like this. The Major's voice drifted in through the smoke, unhurried. "You see," he said, "we don't need to kill you tonight. We just need to show the world that you bleed." The building shook as something landed outside. Blade felt it before he saw it. Pressure, gravity shifting. A familiar, overwhelming presence that made his instincts scream louder than Millennium ever had. The wall exploded inward. Alucard stepped through the debris, coat fluttering, red eyes bright with interest. He took in the scene in a glance. blade bleeding, Millennium forces repositioning instantly, the Major's delighted expression. "Well," Alucard said pleasantly, "this looks unfair." Millennium didn't panic. They adapted again. Heavy weapons opened fire on Alucard immediately, tearing him apart in spectacular fashion. Limbs scattered. Blood splashed across walls. Blade watched, grimly unsurprised, as Alucard laughed through it and began to reassemble. But Millennium didn't focus on Alucard. They focused on Blade. The Major gestured, and a containment field snapped into place around the shop, energy crackling as it pinned Blade where he stood. Pain lanced through him as his muscles locked up, nervous system screaming under the suppression. Alucard noticed. "Oh," he said, head tilting as his body finished knitting together. "You're ignoring me, how rude." The Major smiled wider. "You're not the objective tonight." Blade strained against the field, vision blurring as another round punched into his thigh. He felt himself slipping, body reaching limits it couldn't ignore anymore. Alucard stepped forward. The atmosphere changed instantly. The shadows around him thickened, pressing outward as he moved through the field without resistance, tearing it apart like tissue paper. He reached the Major in a blink, fingers closing around the man's throat. "Careful," Alucard said lightly. "He's mine to observe." The Major didn't struggle. He laughed, delighted. "Oh, Count Dracula," he said, "you misunderstand. We're not stealing your toy." Alucard raised an eyebrow. "We're sharpening it." The street erupted as secondary charges detonated, collapsing buildings on either side and separating Blade from Alucard in a cascade of fire and concrete. Blade was thrown clear, slamming into the pavement hard enough to crack ribs. He tasted blood and knew he was done running. When the dust settled, Millennium was gone. No pursuit, no finishing strike. Just silence. Alucard stood amid the wreckage on the far side of the collapse, staring at the empty street where the Major had been. His smile was gone now, replaced by something thoughtful. Blade pushed himself upright with visible effort, body screaming in protest. Alucard's gaze flicked to him, assessing, amused. "Well," Alucard said, "that was educational." Sirens approached in the distance. Hellsing units finally breaking through the chaos. Integra's voice crackled faintly over Blade's restored comms. "Report." Blade looked at the devastation around him, at the blood soaking into London pavement, at Alucard standing untouched where armies had failed. "Millennium, not playing anymore," Blade said, "and I'm not collateral." Alucard chuckled softly. "No," he agreed, "you're bait." Blade met his gaze without flinching. "And you're letting them." For a moment, something like respect flickered in Alucard's eyes. "Oh," he said, "this just became interesting." Above them, unseen by either hunter, satellites shifted orbit and new orders crossed encrypted channels. Millennium had drawn blood, and the war was about to go global. Millennium stopped hiding the moment they confirmed Blade could bleed. The next 24 hours erased any illusion that London's war could be contained. Attacks rippled outward from the city in coordinated strikes across Europe, each one timed to coincide with Hellsing deployments. Airports, military depots, communication hubs, not random terror, but infrastructure pressure designed to stretch response capability thin and force hard choices about where to commit power. Blade followed the pattern from a Hellsing operations room, his body wrapped in bandages that couldn't fully mask the damage. He sat upright despite the pain, refusing sedation, eyes fixed on tactical overlays as casualty projections updated in real time. Millennium wasn't testing anymore. They were executing a campaign. "They're forcing escalation," Blade said quietly. "They want you visible everywhere at once." Integra stood at the head of the room, hands braced on the table. "They want Alucard unleashed." Alucard, lounging nearby with infuriating ease, grinned. "I do make a mess." That's exactly the problem, Integra replied coldly. Every time you deploy openly, they gain propaganda and morale. They don't need to beat you. They just need the world to believe you can't be everywhere. Blade shifted, wincing as cracked ribs protested. They're changing the rules. No more shadows, no more deniability. Sierra's listened silently, her expression tense. She'd seen what Millennium did when Alucard entered a fight, how they swarmed him with fanatic glee while others died elsewhere. She didn't say it aloud, but she understood now. Raw power drew attention. Discipline redirected it. The next strike hit Paris. Millennium airships breached restricted airspace without warning, deploying vampire infantry directly into civilian zones while broadcasting the assault live across hijacked networks. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't just war. It was theater. Hellsing responded with force. Alucard was deployed. Blade wasn't. That decision burned. Blade listened to the Paris feed from a secure transport, jaw tight as explosions echoed through the speakers. He could hear Alucard laughing through artillery fire, feel the way Millennium units pivoted toward him like moths to flame. And beneath it all, Blade heard the cost. Screams. Collateral. The city paying for a battle it hadn't chosen. He clenched his fists and forced himself to stay seated. This wasn't his call. When the transport finally landed outside a secondary engagement zone, Blade pushed himself out before the medics could object. The air smelled like fuel and blood. Hellsing units were pinned down by Millennium forces dug into a fortified transit hub, their attention split between holding civilians and preventing a breach that would collapse the entire line. Blade took one look and started moving. He didn't charge. He circled. Using service tunnels and maintenance shafts, Blade slipped beneath the battlefield, mapping enemy positions by sound and vibration. His injuries slowed him, forced him to pause and control his breathing, but they didn't stop him. When he struck, it was precise. Command elements first. Communications second. He took out 3 officers without alerting the main force, cutting the spine out of the operation before Millennium realized what was happening. Above ground, Sierra's felt the shift. Enemy fire faltered. Movements grew sloppy. For the first time in hours, the pressure eased. She pushed forward, rallying Hellsing units as Blade emerged from below, bloodied but upright. "You shouldn't be here," she said, equal parts relief and concern. Blade reloaded calmly. Neither should they. Millennium adapted again. A heavy unit breached the hub's eastern wall, armored vampires pouring in with overwhelming force. Blade took a direct hit that sent him crashing into a pillar, vision flashing white as something snapped in his shoulder. He hit the ground hard, struggled to rise, and failed. Sierra stepped in front of him without hesitation. She fought like someone terrified of losing control and doing it anyway. Her strength tore through the first wave, but Blade could see the cracks forming. Every kill pushed her closer to something she wasn't ready to become. "Sierra's," he warned, "pull back." She didn't hear him. The heavy unit raised its weapon for a finishing blow. Alucard arrived like a nightmare given permission. The ceiling collapsed as he dropped into the hub, guns roaring, laughter echoing as Millennium forces turned on him instantly. He tore through them with obscene ease, bodies disintegrating under relentless fire. The fight ended quickly after that. Too quickly. When the dust settled, the hub was secure, but the damage was catastrophic. Civilian casualties were high. Infrastructure ruined. Millennium's broadcast looped the footage endlessly before Hellsing could cut it. Blade sat against the wall, cradling his useless arm, watching medics work around him. Alucard approached, expression unreadable for once. "You're slowing them down," Alucard said thoughtfully. "That's annoying." Blade looked up at him. "You're speeding them up." Alucard smiled faintly. "Yes." Integra arrived moments later, surveying the devastation with hard eyes. "This cannot continue," she said. They're controlling the pace. Blade forced himself to stand, ignoring the protest from his body. Then stop giving them what they want. Silence fell. Integra looked at him sharply. Explain. They want gods and monsters on camera, Blade said. So don't give them that fight. Give them attrition, disruption. Make every victory invisible and every loss expensive. Alucard chuckled. You're suggesting I sit out. I'm suggesting, Blade replied evenly, you become the threat they can't predict. Alucard studied him for a long moment, red eyes searching. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Oh, I like you, he said. You're fragile and irritating. Integra made her decision. From that moment on, Hellsing's war changed. Alucard was no longer the spear. He was the deterrent. Blade, wounded and exhausted, became something else entirely. A hunter inside a larger war. A variable Millennium couldn't overpower without committing resources they couldn't afford to lose. And Millennium noticed. Intercepted communications shifted tone. Less mockery, more urgency, orders tightened, kill teams reassigned. Blade's name resurfaced. Not as bait. As a priority. As he was wheeled back toward the transport, alarms flared again, sharper than before. New intelligence streamed in, marked with levels Hellsing rarely used. Integra's voice cut through the noise. Millennium has confirmed a target outside Europe. Blade looked up slowly. Where? He asked. Integra met his gaze without blinking. Japan. Alucard's smile returned, slow and dangerous. The war had crossed a line. And this time, retreat was no longer an option. Japan didn't know it was a battlefield yet. That was the point. Millennium's movements were quieter here, surgical instead of theatrical. No airships blotting out the sky. No public broadcasts. Just disappearances, strange reports filed and buried, and a steady increase in unexplained violence in industrial districts far from tourist cameras. Blade studied the intelligence from a Hellsing transport cutting low over the coastline, eyes narrowed as patterns emerged. This wasn't escalation through fear. It was preparation. They're setting the table, Blade said, voice rough but steady. His shoulder was immobilized, ribs still cracked beneath layers of reinforced bandage, but he was upright, alert. Factories, ports, supply chains, they're building something. Integra nodded once. A staging ground. If London was the statement, this is the infrastructure. Alucard leaned against the bulkhead, arms folded, looking bored. How very industrious of them. Blade ignored him and focused on the map. Millennium units were clustered near abandoned industrial zones, but their logistics flowed inward, not outward. Something was being assembled, or awakened. Hellsing deployed cautiously. No grand entrances. No Alucard in the open. Small teams moved under cover of night, coordinating with local forces that didn't fully understand what they were assisting. Blade operated independently again, not as a centerpiece, but as a probe, slipping into Millennium-held territory to confirm what intelligence suggested. What he found made his jaw tighten. These weren't just vampires. They were experiments. Augmented units, grafted with mechanical reinforcement, some barely stable, others frighteningly efficient. Blade took one down in a shipping yard after a brutal fight that left him barely standing, silver blade snapping off inside reinforced bone. He finished it with a point-blank UV burst and staggered away before reinforcements arrived. Millennium was evolving. They were building soldiers meant to survive against monsters like Alucard by overwhelming everything else. Siras saw the aftermath when Blade returned, bloodied and limping, dragging proof behind him. Her expression hardened as she took in the ruined body. They did this, she whispered, on purpose. Blade nodded. They're not afraid of him, he said, meaning Alucard. They're planning around him. That was worse. The first major confrontation hit 3 nights later. A Millennium convoy rolled through an industrial corridor under heavy escort, carrying something massive beneath armored plating. Hellsing units moved to intercept, but Millennium anticipated it, springing traps that pinned them down before they could engage properly. Blade got there first. He hit the convoy from above, dropping onto the lead vehicle and planting charges before diving clear as it detonated. The explosion threw armored vampires into the air, but the cargo didn't stop moving. Whatever was inside the transport absorbed the blast and kept going. Blade landed hard, rolled, and came up firing, targeting joints, optics, anything that slowed movement. He fought like a man buying seconds, not victories, retreating when pressure mounted, re-engaging from new angles. Then the cargo emerged. A towering, partially mechanized vampire, restraints snapping as it tore free of its transport, eyes burning with feral intelligence. This wasn't a ghoul. This wasn't even a soldier. This was a prototype. Blade felt the weight of it immediately. He hit it with everything he had left, silver rounds, UV bursts, explosives, and watched it adapt in real time, armor shifting, systems compensating. It slammed him into a wall hard enough to crater steel, knocking the air from his lungs and sending pain cascading through his already damaged body. Syrah's arrived moments later, intercepting the creature before it could finish him. She fought it head-on, strength against engineered brutality, the clash shaking the entire corridor. Blade forced himself up, vision swimming, and realized the truth. She couldn't win this alone. Alucard arrived last. He looked at the creature once and laughed. Oh, they've been busy. He tore it apart in seconds. Not a fight, a demonstration. The prototype never had a chance against him, limbs shredded, core crushed, regeneration overwhelmed by sheer disparity in power. But Blade didn't feel relief. He felt dread. Millennium had watched this happen. They'd seen what worked, what didn't. They hadn't deployed one prototype. They deployed a test. Back at the temporary command site, Integra reviewed the aftermath with grim focus. They're measuring thresholds, she said. Yours, she nodded toward Blade, and his. Alucard smiled. I do love an audience. Blade didn't. They're learning where you're unnecessary. That got Alucard's attention. Say that again. Blade met his gaze steadily. They're not trying to beat you everywhere. They're trying to build a war you don't have time to fight alone. Silence stretched. Syrah's broke it, voice low. They're hunting people like us, not gods, survivors. Blade nodded. Predators hunt the herd first. The next Millennium transmission confirmed it. A hijacked broadcast cut across regional networks, brief and unmistakable. The Major's smiling face filled the screen, eyes alight with satisfaction. Good evening, he said cheerfully. We've learned so much, and now we'll see what happens when the hunters are scattered. Coordinates followed. Multiple locations, simultaneous strikes. Not aimed at Alucard. Aimed at Blade. Aimed at Syrah's. Aimed at every operative Hellsing, relied on to function beneath the shadow of its monster. Integra looked at the map, calculating losses before they happened. They're forcing dispersion, she said. If we concentrate, civilians die elsewhere. Alucard chuckled darkly. And if you scatter, I can't be everywhere. Blade loaded fresh magazines with shaking hands. That's the point. The war had shifted again. It was no longer about power. It was about survival under something that couldn't be everywhere at once. And Millennium was about to find out just how dangerous wounded predators could be. The strikes came all at once. No warning sirens, no build-up, just red alerts cascading across Hellsing's tactical displays as Millennium cells activated in half a dozen locations simultaneously. Industrial zones erupted into firefights. Transit hubs went dark, Entire neighborhoods vanished behind walls of smoke and emergency cordons before local authorities could even identify what they were responding to. Blade was already moving when the first confirmation came through. He didn't wait for orders. He couldn't. Integra's strategy was clear, and so was Millennium. Alucard would be forced to choose where to appear, and everywhere he didn't would become a slaughterhouse. Blade grabbed his weapons, checked his dwindling supply, and headed straight for the nearest hotspot. This one was personal. The location wasn't random. It was a logistics node Blade had flagged days earlier, a place Millennium had intentionally left quiet. Now it was crawling with augmented vampires, coordinated and disciplined, pushing toward a refugee shelter that hadn't finished evacuating. Blade hit them hard and fast. He dropped from above, severing a command unit with precise strikes before the rest could react. Silver blades flashed. UV bursts screamed. He moved through the fight like a man who knew exactly how long his body could hold together and intended to spend every second of it. He took hits doing it, heavy blows that cracked bone and sent him skidding across concrete, but he kept getting back up. Not because he was stronger, because he was stubborn. Millennium adjusted within minutes. Heavier units entered the field, weapons calibrated to suppress rather than kill, forcing Blade to expend energy breaking free instead of pressing the attack. One caught him clean across the chest, sending him crashing into a truck hard enough to dent steel. He stayed down longer that time, breath hitching as pain roared through his system. The Major's voice crackled over external speakers. "Daywalker," it said warmly, "you're proving our hypothesis." Blade forced himself upright, blood running freely now. "You talk too much," he muttered, hurling a blade that took a vampire through the eye. "You cannot be everywhere," the Major continued unfazed, "and neither can our dear Count." Elsewhere, Alucard tore through a separate strike zone with savage delight, but even he felt the strain now. Not physically, strategically. Every time he appeared, Millennium units pulled back, only to resurface somewhere else. He annihilated what he touched, but what he didn't touch burned. Integra watched the map fracture. "This is unsustainable," she said quietly. "They're bleeding us dry." Sierras was in the thick of it across the city, fighting alone for the first time without immediate support. She was stronger now, faster, but every kill chipped away at something human inside her. Blade could hear it in her voice when she checked in, breathless, strained, holding herself together by will alone. "I can't keep this up," she admitted between shots. Blade clenched his jaw. "You don't have to win," he told her. "Just don't break." His own fight reached its breaking point minutes later. A coordinated strike pinned him down in open ground, heavy fire forcing him behind cover that was rapidly disintegrating. His ammunition ran dry faster than he'd calculated. He reached for a blade and found only one left. The Major stepped into view again, smiling. "You see," he said, "immortality is inefficient, it draws attention, but you're perfect." Blade lunged. He didn't make it halfway before a containment field slammed into place around him, locking his muscles and dropping him to one knee. Pain surged as suppressants flooded the area, tearing at his nervous system and halting regeneration entirely. Blade gritted his teeth, refusing to scream. "This is where you stop," the Major said almost kindly. Then the field collapsed. Not shattered. Collapsed. The pressure vanished in an instant, replaced by something colder and far heavier. The shadows bent inward as Alucard stepped through the air itself, eyes burning brighter than Blade had ever seen. "Oh," Alucard said softly, "you found my favorite toy." Millennium forces didn't flee. They surged. Alucard met them with a violence that was no longer playful. He didn't laugh this time. He moved with brutal efficiency, tearing through ranks without spectacle, ending the fight in seconds. Blade watched from the ground, helpless, as the last of the attackers were reduced to nothing. When it was over, Alucard turned to Blade. He crouched, studying him closely, and for the first time his expression wasn't amused. "They almost had you," Alucard said. "Clever little monsters." Blade dragged in a breath. "They still might." Alucard smiled slowly. "Yes, that's the interesting part." Across the city, Millennium strikes withdrew almost simultaneously, their objectives achieved. Casualties were severe, infrastructure damage irreversible, and something else had shifted. Millennium had proven that even immortality had limits. Not in endurance. In reach. Integra received the final report in silence. "They've confirmed our breaking point," she said, "and now they know yours." Blade was carried back to Hellsing's command center, unconscious before they arrived. When he woke hours later, his body felt like it had been run through a grinder, healing sluggish and incomplete. Sira sat nearby, eyes red-rimmed but steady. "You didn't die," she said quietly. Blade managed a weak smirk. "Low bar." Alarms began to sound again. Different this time. Integra entered the room, expression hard. "Millennium has initiated Phase 3, she said. "They're no longer targeting assets." Blade pushed himself up slowly. "Then what?" Integra met his gaze. "They're targeting symbols." Outside, a new broadcast hijacked every available channel. The Major's face filled the screen, smiling wider than ever. "Let us see," he said brightly, "how the world reacts when its monsters begin to fail." And behind him, bound and bloodied, was a familiar figure. Sira's Victoria. The room went silent the moment Sira's appeared on the screen. She was restrained, bloodied, forced to her knees beneath harsh lights that cast no shadows Millennium couldn't control. Her eyes were still defiant, but the strain showed in the way her shoulders trembled and her breathing came too fast. The Major stood beside her, gloved hand resting casually on her shoulder like a host presenting a guest. Integra didn't move. She didn't speak. Her face hardened into something sharper than anger. Blade felt it hit him a second later, a cold, focused pressure that pushed past pain and exhaustion and settled into something dangerous. Sira's wasn't just a soldier. She was proof that Hellsing could still create something human out of the monstrous. Millennium knew that. That was why they'd taken her alive. "They want a response," Blade said quietly. "They want a spectacle," Integra replied. "A public failure." Alucard watched the screen with open interest, head tilted, eyes bright. There was no fear in him, no concern, but there was something else now, attention sharpened into intent. The broadcast continued. The Major spoke warmly about inevitability, about how symbols inspired hope only until they bled. He spoke of Hellsing as an outdated myth clinging to monsters it couldn't control, and of a future where obedience would be engineered rather than hoped for. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Then he made his offer. A location, a time. One exchange. Alucard. For Sira's. Blade turned toward Integra immediately. "It's a trap." "Yes," Integra said without hesitation, "and we're going anyway." The preparation was brutal and fast. Hellsing mobilized everything it could without broadcasting intent. Alucard was not briefed. He didn't ask to be. He simply stood, coat immaculate, waiting. Blade was ordered to remain behind, his injuries too severe, his presence too volatile. Blade ignored the order. He armed himself quietly, checking weapons with hands that shook only slightly. He wasn't strong enough to fight Alucard's battles. He knew that. But this wasn't about beating Millennium's apex forces. This was about getting Sira's back alive. The exchange site was a cathedral long since abandoned, its spires cracked, its interior gutted and repurposed into a killing ground. Millennium forces lined the upper balconies and nave, weapons trained inward, banners hanging like mockery of faith. Sira's was bound at the altar. Alucard walked down the center aisle alone. Blade watched from the shadows outside, heart pounding, every instinct screaming restraint and action in equal measure. He tracked positions, counted guns, noted exit points that didn't exist. Millennium had built this place to contain gods. The Major waited at the altar, smiling. "You came," he said. "How very predictable." Alucard stopped several meters away. "You're boring," he replied pleasantly. "Release my property." The Major chuckled. "Ah, but she isn't yours, she's a symbol. And symbols," he gestured broadly, "are meant to be broken." The first shot rang out without warning. Not at Alucard. At Sira's. The bullet tore through her shoulder, spinning her to the ground as the cathedral erupted into chaos. Blade moved instantly, sprinting toward a side entrance as Hellsing units engaged from concealed positions. Alucard didn't react the way Millennium expected. He didn't charge. He stood still. Then the air changed. The shadows deepened, thickening until the light itself seemed to hesitate. Alucard stepped forward, and Millennium's containment systems activated all at once, wards flaring, suppression fields screaming as they tried to pin him in place. They failed. Alucard moved anyway. What followed wasn't a fight, it was a collapse. Millennium forces poured fire into him, tearing his body apart again and again, but the damage no longer slowed him. He crossed the distance in seconds, reaching the altar as Blade burst through a side door and slid into cover, firing to clear a path. Blade reached Sira's first. He cut her restraints with shaking hands, hauling her upright as another barrage of gunfire shredded the stone around them. She was barely conscious, blood slick on her uniform, eyes struggling to focus. "I've got you," Blade said, voice low and steady. "Stay with me." Alucard reached the Major a heartbeat later. He didn't kill him. He grabbed him by the face and slammed him into the altar hard enough to shatter stone, pinning him there as shadows wrapped around the man's limbs. The Major laughed through broken teeth, delighted even now. "Yes," he gasped, "that's it, show them." Blade dragged Sira's toward the exit, fighting through resistance that seemed more determined now than ever. Millennium units flooded the lower levels, abandoning any pretense of containing Alucard in favor of stopping Blade. He took hits doing it, rounds tearing through muscle, one blade snapping off uselessly, but he kept moving, adapting on the fly. They reached the threshold, just as the cathedral began to come apart. Above them, Alucard escalated. The seals broke. Blade felt it even from a distance, the pressure slamming into his chest like a physical force. The shadows exploded outward, swallowing Millennium forces whole as Alucard unleashed something vast and terrible. The cathedral roof collapsed under the weight of it, spires tearing free and crashing into the streets below. Blade didn't look back. He carried Sira's out into the night as the building behind them imploded, the sound of destruction drowning out the Major's laughter at last. The extraction was barely controlled. Hellsing units pulled back under heavy fire as Alucard's presence drew everything toward the collapsing site. Blade handed Sira's over to medics and collapsed against a transport, vision swimming, body finally giving out. He woke hours later. Sira survived, barely. Millennium's leadership cell at the cathedral was annihilated, thoroughly. But the cost was unmistakable. Satellite feeds had captured everything. Alucard unleashed. The world had seen it. Integra stood alone in the command room, watching global response indicators spike. Military movements, emergency summits, classified channels lighting up faster than they could be answered. Blade joined her quietly, leaning on the wall to stay upright. "They got what they wanted," he said. Integra didn't disagree. Yes, they forced the world to notice. Alucard stood nearby, shadows finally settling, expression unreadable. He looked less amused now, less entertained. Millennium was crippled. But something worse had begun. The world had seen what Hellsing's monster truly was, and now it would decide what to do about it. The backlash didn't wait for confirmation. It started before the cathedral's dust settled, before casualty counts stabilized, before Hellsing could even finish pulling its people out of London. Governments didn't need a full report. They had footage. Grainy, shaky, undeniable footage of Alucard tearing a city landmark apart like it was paper, shadows swallowing soldiers whole, the laws of physics bending around something that wore a man's shape and laughed while it did it. Emergency councils convened within hours. NATO classified briefings were leaked before they were finalized. Intelligence agencies that had tolerated Hellsing as a necessary inconvenience suddenly had to justify why a private organization was allowed to deploy a weapon that looked indistinguishable from an apocalypse. Millennium had wanted a spectacle. They'd gotten one that scared everyone, not just their enemies. Blade watched the response unfold from a secure medical wing, his body strapped into recovery braces that slowed him down but didn't stop him from listening. His ribs were still cracked. His leg throbbed with every heartbeat. He'd pushed himself past his limits too many times in too short a span, and now the bill was coming due. Sierra was alive, stable and furious. She paced the room like a caged animal, shoulder bandaged, eyes burning. "They used me," she snapped. "They turned me into bait." "They turned you into a trigger," Blade corrected calmly. "That matters." She stopped looking at him, and now. Blade didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. The answer was playing on every screen in the building. Hellsing headquarters lit up with incoming demands. Joint oversight, external review, immediate suspension of Alucard's deployment. Some messages were diplomatic, others were ultimatums. The tone was unanimous. Containment. Integra read them all without comment. When she finally spoke, it wasn't to the room. It was to Alucard. "You are grounded," she said flatly. The word hung in the air. Alucard's smile didn't falter, but something behind it cooled. "I beg your pardon." "You will not deploy without my direct authorization," Integra continued. "No public engagements, no independent action, not until this situation stabilizes." Alucard laughed once, sharp and mirthless. "You're afraid." "I am responsible," Integra replied. "There is a difference." Blade watched the exchange carefully. This was the first time he'd seen someone draw a line in front of Alucard without trembling. It wasn't strength that let Integra do it. It was authority born of consequence. She understood exactly what she was risking. Alucard stepped closer, shadows stirring faintly. "And if I refuse?" Integra met his gaze without blinking. "Then Millennium will be the least of our problems, and you know it." For a long moment, it felt like the world held its breath again. Then Alucard chuckled softly and stepped back. "Very well," he said. "I'll behave." Blade didn't believe him. Neither did Integra. The next strike didn't come from Millennium. It came from above. Unmarked drones began appearing at the edges of London airspace, testing response times, mapping energy signatures left behind by Alucard's release. Satellite constellations adjusted orbit, focusing on Hellsing facilities with an intensity that felt invasive even through layers of encryption. This wasn't an attack. It was assessment. The world was measuring the cost of letting monsters exist. Blade was cleared for limited field duty 3 days later. He moved slower now, body still healing, but his mind was sharper than ever. If the war had shifted away from vampires and toward geopolitics, then his role changed with it. He wasn't a symbol. He wasn't a weapon of mass destruction. He was something governments understood. A man with limits. His first assignment wasn't combat. It was reconnaissance. Blade slipped into a black market meet on the outskirts of Prague, tracking whispers of Millennium remnants trying to regroup under new leadership. He confirmed what Hellsing suspected. The organization was shattered but not dead. Cells were going to ground, shedding old hierarchies, adapting the way they always had. More troubling were the new players circling the wreckage. Private military contractors, intelligence cutouts, black-budget research divisions. Everyone wanted data on what Millennium had built and on what Hellsing controlled. Blade returned with confirmation and a warning. "This isn't about vampires anymore," he told Integra. "It's about arms races." She nodded grimly. "Yes, and Alucard is the most expensive one on the board." Sierras listened quietly, absorbing the weight of it. She'd been created to fight monsters. Now she was one. Alucard, for his part, seemed amused by the world's anxiety. He paced less, watched more. Sometimes Blade caught him standing at windows for hours, staring at the city like it was a puzzle that had finally become interesting. The breaking point came a week later. A joint task force demanded access to Hellsing's sealed archives and custody of Alucard for evaluation purposes. The wording was polite. The subtext was not. Integra refused. The response was immediate. Sanctions, asset freezes, travel restrictions, quiet preparations for something harsher if compliance didn't follow. Hellsing's autonomy, something it had guarded for generations, began to erode under pressure that couldn't be shot or burned away. Blade stood in the corridor outside Integra's office as voices rose inside, diplomats arguing in clipped tones. He understood this kind of fight. You couldn't win it with force, only with leverage. And Hellsing's leverage was a monster the world had decided it was done tolerating. Blade turned away and made a decision of his own. If the world was going to push back, it needed a reason to focus somewhere else. Somewhere far from London. Somewhere that reminded it monsters weren't the only danger left. Blade disappeared that night, slipping past security with ease born of long habit. Integra realized he was gone minutes later. Alucard realized seconds after that. "Oh," Alucard said softly, smiling to himself, "you're going to make things worse." Blade didn't hear him. He was already hunting again. And this time, the world was about to notice for all the wrong reasons. Blade chose his battleground carefully. If the world was going to treat monsters as strategic assets, then it needed to be reminded what happened when humans tried to own them. Millennium remnants were perfect for that purpose. Not because they were powerful anymore, but because they were desperate, fractured, and reckless enough to sell pieces of their work to anyone with money and no conscience. Blade followed that trail east. Black market labs, decommissioned military bunkers, offshore platforms operating under shell companies that vanished as soon as questions were asked. Everywhere he went, he found the same thing: incomplete copies of Millennium's experiments, crude attempts to recreate what had taken decades of fanaticism to build. And every one of them failed. The first lab went up in flames after Blade cleared it, the fire visible for kilometers. He left bodies behind, evidence behind, enough for intelligence agencies to trace the fallout back to the buyers and start asking uncomfortable questions. He didn't hide what he was doing. He couldn't afford to. He wanted attention. Not on Hellsing. On the people who thought they could replace it. Blade paid for every strike. His body never fully recovered between engagements. Old wounds reopened. New ones stacked on top of them. He slept in short bursts, ate when he remembered, and stitched himself together in abandoned buildings that smelled like oil and rot. He fought smart, avoided direct confrontations when possible, but sometimes there was no clean exit. In Warsaw, a failed prototype nearly killed him. The thing had Millennium bones and borrowed technology layered on top, regeneration unpredictable but violent. Blade barely brought it down by collapsing the building around it, escaping through rubble with broken fingers and a fractured collarbone. He lay there afterward, gasping, staring up at the night sky, knowing he'd cut his margin down to nothing. This was the cost. Not glory, not victory. Attrition. Back in London, Integra watched the fallout spread. Intelligence briefings shifted tone rapidly. Governments that had been pressing Hellsing for access suddenly found themselves scrambling to contain their own scandals as black sites were exposed and illegal research programs surfaced. Blade's actions were forcing accountability at gunpoint, and no one could openly condemn him without admitting what they'd been funding. Sierras followed the reports obsessively. She recognized the pattern in Blade's movements, the way he never stayed long enough to rest, the way he kept choosing fights that would wear him down. She knew that mentality. She lived it. "He's killing himself," she said quietly. Alucard listened, amused but attentive. "Yes," he agreed, "that's what makes it fascinating." Sierras turned on him, fury flashing. "You could stop him." Alucard shrugged. "Why would I? He's proving a point." Integra entered the room, expression grim. "He's also becoming a liability. If he dies out there, he becomes a martyr, and martyrs are useful to people with agendas." Alucard smiled wider. "Then perhaps we should retrieve him before he breaks." That was the moment Integra realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. Blade had become leverage. The breaking point came in the Baltic. Blade tracked a shipment to an offshore platform repurposed as a mobile research facility, guarded by mercenaries who thought money insulated them from consequences. The fight was brutal and close. Blade took down the outer perimeter quietly, but inside he ran headlong into resistance far heavier than anticipated. Someone had been waiting for him. The lab's core housed a near-complete construct, not stable, not finished, but powerful enough to tear through Blade's defenses and pin him against a bulkhead. His weapons failed one by one. His body gave out, muscles locking up as damage overwhelmed his healing entirely. For the first time since entering this world, Blade couldn't retreat. The construct raised its arm for a killing blow. The platform shook. The lights died, and the shadows arrived. Alucard stepped into the chamber like a king walking into a courtroom, eyes glowing faintly, coat immaculate despite the chaos. He didn't rush. He didn't escalate. He simply ended it. The construct disintegrated under his hand, not destroyed so much as dismissed. The remaining mercenaries fled or died screaming. Blade slumped to the floor, barely conscious, breath rattling in his chest. Alucard crouched beside him, studying the damage with interest. "You're breaking," he observed calmly. Blade managed a weak smile. "Took you long enough." Alucard laughed softly and lifted him with one hand, carrying him out of the collapsing facility as explosions tore it apart behind them. When Blade woke again, it was in Hellsing medical custody, every system working overtime to keep him alive. Integra stood nearby, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You disobeyed direct authority," she said. Blade closed his eyes briefly. "Did it work?" She didn't answer immediately. Then quietly, "Yes." The world's pressure had shifted. Governments backed off. Oversight demands softened. Attention redirected. Blade had given them a different problem to worry about. But the cost was undeniable. Blade couldn't stand unassisted. His healing was compromised. The war had taken something permanent from him. Sierra sat beside his bed, silent but present. Alucard watched from the doorway, amused as ever. "You humans are so fragile," he said lightly. "It's adorable." Blade looked at him, eyes tired but steady. "And you monsters never know when to stop." Alucard's grin faded just a fraction. Outside, emergency alerts flared again. Not Millennium. Not governments. Something new had surfaced, drawn by the chaos, by the exposure of monsters and secrets alike. Integra's voice carried down the hall, sharp and urgent. "We have a confirmed breach," she said. "Unknown origin, not Millennium, not human." Alucard's eyes lit up. Blade felt it too, even through the pain. Whatever was coming next didn't care about symbols or politics. It cared about feeding. And Hellsing's war was about to enter its final, bloodiest phase. The breach didn't announce itself with explosions or broadcasts. It arrived quietly, spreading through the undercurrents of the world like an infection no one had screened for. Entire intelligence networks went blind in the span of minutes. Surveillance feeds looped outdated footage. Dead zones appeared on maps where nothing had ever gone missing before. Whatever had crossed over into this world didn't want attention. It wanted access. Integra recognized the pattern immediately. "This isn't a faction," she said grimly. "It's a predator." The entity wasn't vampiric in the traditional sense. It didn't rely on blood alone. It fed on instability, on power systems, on supernatural concentrations, on the residue left behind by Alucard's releases and Millennium's experiments. Every clash, every escalation had thinned the barrier between worlds just enough to invite something that didn't belong. Blade felt it even from his hospital bed. The pressure in the air was wrong, heavy, suffocating, like the moment before a storm breaks stretched out endlessly. His body was wrecked, healing slowed to a crawl, muscles screaming in protest when he tried to move. Whatever this thing was, he wouldn't be fighting it the way he used to. Alucard, on the other hand, was delighted. "This," he said, eyes gleaming as the first reports came in, "is what happens when the house gets too loud." The entity struck its first major target at a sealed Hellsing vault beneath London, a location layered with wards and defenses meant to contain things that never saw daylight. It bypassed them effortlessly. When response teams arrived, there were no bodies. Just emptiness. No blood, no heat signatures, no souls for Alucard to taste when he arrived minutes later. For the first time, his grin faltered. Whatever had done this didn't fight like a monster. It erased. Integra made the call immediately. "This ends now," she said. "No escalation, no spectacle. We shut it down quietly or it spreads." Alucard tilted his head. "And how, exactly, do you plan to stop something that doesn't care if I exist?" Her eyes shifted to Blade. "By doing what it doesn't expect," she said. "We don't send a god." Blade understood before she finished. The entity was drawn to excess. Raw power, uncontrolled immortality, concentrations of supernatural force. Alucard was a beacon. Blade wasn't. He was damaged, finite, human enough to pass beneath its notice long enough to get close. Syrah's objected immediately. "He can't, he's barely standing." Blade pushed himself upright anyway, pain flashing white behind his eyes. "That's why it'll work." The trap was simple and brutal. Alucard would draw the entity's attention elsewhere, unleashing just enough of his presence to pull it toward a controlled zone outside the city. Not a fight, a lure. Meanwhile, Blade would infiltrate the source point Hellsing had identified, an unstable convergence where the barrier had thinned completely. If Blade failed, there would be no second attempt. Alucard wouldn't survive the correction that followed. The operation began at dawn. Alucard tore through the outskirts of London with deliberate excess, shadows rolling, presence flaring just enough to tear a hole in the world's attention. The entity responded immediately, reality warping as it followed the signal like a scent. The ground buckled where it passed. Alucard met it briefly, testing, confirming what they already knew. It couldn't be killed. Not by force. Blade moved unseen beneath it all, slipping through maintenance tunnels and forgotten access points, body screaming with every step. He reached the convergence point, a chamber that felt wrong the moment he entered it, air vibrating, space folding in on itself. The entity's anchor pulsed at the center. Not alive. Not dead. Just wrong. Blade planted his charges with shaking hands, knowing exactly what would happen when they went off. This wasn't a bomb. It was a severance. It would collapse the anchor and seal the breach, but anything inside the convergence when it happened would be erased with it. There was no timer. Manual detonation only. Alucard's voice crackled through the calm, unusually serious. "You've got seconds," he said. "It's noticed the trick." The chamber began to distort violently as the entity pulled back, sensing loss. Blade staggered, vision blurring, one knee hitting the floor as pain overwhelmed his system. He forced himself upright, thumb hovering over the trigger. He thought of nothing heroic. Just work. Blade triggered the charge. The world folded inward. There was no explosion, no sound. The chamber simply ceased to exist, space snapping shut like a wound cauterized instantly. The pressure vanished. The air stabilized. The entity screamed once, not in pain but in denial, and was gone. Alucard felt it immediately. The pull vanished. The silence that followed was absolute. When Hellsing teams reached the site, there was nothing left of the chamber. No residue, no body. Blade was gone. Sirez dropped to her knees when the confirmation came through. Integra closed her eyes once, slowly, then straightened. Alucard stared at the empty space for a long time. "Interesting," he murmured. The world never learned what had almost happened. Officially, the crisis was classified as a contained anomaly. Governments quietly dismantled black budget programs and stopped asking questions they didn't want answered. The pressure on Hellsing eased, not out of trust, but fear of what further interference might provoke. Alucard returned to his usual habits, amused, unchanged. Except sometimes, he stood a little longer at windows. Sirez took on more responsibility, harder, sharper, carrying Blade's example with her whether she wanted to or not. She became something different, not a symbol but a reminder. Integra continued to lead, knowing exactly where the line now was. Power without restraint invited things worse than monsters. Blade never became a legend. There were no memorials, no footage, no speeches. Just a sealed file marked resolved. And somewhere beyond perception, a universe closed a door it would not open again. The gods remained. But the world learned something far more important. Even monsters had limits. And humanity decided where they ended.